do that. Good, amazing. So we're going live now, Ken. Very excited about this one. We will wait a couple of minutes as people jump on, but if you're joining us now, say hello. Drop in a comment, say where you're dialing in from and what you do. We would love to hear from you. But really today, if you're attending this webinar, this is about decoding ESG for benefit and value. And Ken and I got together and thought, what would be a great topic to talk about? And we felt really understanding or diving into several topics around ESG, which are often neglected, would be really valuable for people to understand, because, people are certainly talking about ESG so much now. And so it just would be wonderful to really dive into the topics that are often overlooked. And I'd love to introduce you to Ken and also just say hello to James. I can see you're on. I can see a few of you here on LinkedIn. So say hello, tell us who you are, what you do. We'd love to hear from you. And Ken, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. And then
thanks, Meryl, and hi, James, and hi others who have joined or are watching. As Meryl said, we've got together, we've talked a little bit about the different parts of ESG that we spend our time in, and the area that I'm particularly focused on is perhaps more on the S side, less on the E, more on the S, and perhaps increasingly on the G side. And in particular, I've spent quite a few years in the area of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, which obviously is one of the UN sustainable goals, but increasingly, particularly in Australia, it's becoming part of the risk management and governance framework that people address the question of diversity and inclusion. So as we were talking about what's potentially on people's minds, or perhaps what we can put on people's minds, parts of the E, and I think Meryl's going to talk a bit about scope 3, but as we get into the S and the G side, talking a bit about what's going on in the world of diversity and inclusion and what does it mean for organisations, and what are we seeing in terms of the growing expectations on people and how they perform in that area.
Yeah, definitely. And yes, in answer to your question, James, we can see people are on. We only know that you're one of the identified people because LinkedIn doesn't actually show us your names unless you make a comment or put up a comment. So if you want us to know that you're here, make sure you say hello in the comment box. Good question, James. I'm going to present my screen so that you can all see what we have in store for you. And, I guess a little bit about myself. I am a sustainability and circular economy expert. I have been, working in this space for about 12 years and just felt that, it's so important to start looking at cultural shift around sustainability, cultural shifts within businesses to really adopt sustainability at a crucial relationship level, at a decision-making level. And ESG is just a really great tool to do that. So I'm really glad that Ken and I connected recently, and we've been working together on a few different things and decided we should do this together and really talk about a topic that could really help people on this pathway. So decoding ESG for benefit and value, and that's what we're here to do today. So what we're going to do is, we've sort of already talked about ourselves. We don't need to go too much more into that, but really wanted to look at the market, sort of go over it with a lens on what are the kind of key market trends happening in this space, and then look at what are the challenges for businesses, what are they really facing at a operational level, and then to identify where are the opportunities for overcoming these challenges and using ESG for change, leveraging that as the key tool to adopt this change easily and effectively and seamlessly. And so that's really what we're going to go through today. And then at the end of it, really just tell you how you could take things to another level. So, hey, Brendan, how are you? Nice to see you on here. Interact with us, get into the comment sections and be as interactive as you'd like. We'd like to hear your comments, hear your questions. If you have any questions, don't hold back. Ask it at any time. We always invite sort of the interaction here on these sessions. If you've been following me for a little while, I've been running my firm for the last 2.5 years now. And for me, it's really important to bring the right people together in the room to be having these important discussions and really solve these complex problems with the right minds in the room, because I can't do it on my own, and neither can any of us really do it on our own. We need to have all of the right people in there, and that's why I'm really glad to have my colleague here, Ken, who is very, very qualified in the S space around ESG and of course governance as well. So Ken, I'll share a little. I mean, you can share a little bit more about your actual experience in the workspace, and I just wanted to just shout out to Boabdella. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. So yeah, Ken, tell us a little bit more about the work you've done in this space.
Thanks, Meryl, and hi to those who've just joined. As Meryl said, my interest is in diversity, and particularly gender diversity. I spent the best part of 20 years as public company CFO and then CEO of a couple of large corporations in Australia. But in my time, particularly lately as the CFO, then CEO of Crown Resorts, I joined the March Champions of Change group, or now the Champions of Change Coalition, which is a group of Australian, predominantly CEOs, who have gotten together. There's about 260 in the group, who are looking at ways of improving gender diversity in the workplace. And as part of the work I did with that group, I developed some solutions, particularly organisation or enterprise level solutions, to look at trying to address the gender pay gap and looking to try and deal with gender equality issues in the workplace. Out of that came a software product. The product now is one that's in a company that I own and operate. It's called Gender Fitness. It was built with Crown in mind, but also towards the end with Microsoft as the key sponsor and first customer. So I've owned that business now for just over 6 months, and looking to try and use that as a tool to try and improve gender diversity and equality in the workplace.
Yeah, definitely. And gender diversity has been a conversation in business for such a long time. But I think what's often been missed, sort of dashboards and gender fitness, that can really not only make it sort of visual and easy to track these things, but also kind of, the word gamify gets thrown around a lot, but I think it's a good word to kind of gamify this process, because it then kind of helps you not only track and have that transparency, but also motivate you for doing better to meet that gap and close those gaps really around gender and diversity and so on.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, if it's a pretty hackneyed saying, but if you're not measuring something, how can you manage it? And it's one of those pieces of operational information that's never actually been turned into ongoing management tools and reporting tools. So that seemed like a gap. If it proves out to be the case, I think it'll go a long way to start creating kind of a continual dialogue in organisations about how we're travelling. It'll be sitting alongside other metrics, CO2e, revenue, costs, and something around diversity and inclusion as well. Yeah,
definitely. So Ken, let's get into this. We've got 12 people I can see on LinkedIn, thereabouts. So introduce yourselves. I know a few of you have said hello in the comments. We won't know until you say hello in the comments. If you wanted us to know you're here, say hello. But we just wanted to sort of touch on now, what are the kind of trends we're seeing in the market. There are a lot of trends. So, don't shoot the messenger. We're just here to talk about the ones that we think are probably we're best placed to really dive into around ESG, and particularly those that are neglected in the ESG space. So you can see here, like, we've really just identified the first three that we think are most important, and that is around Scope 3 emissions, which often gets neglected because it is a complex one. It's the largest part of most companies' carbon impact, anywhere from 65 to 95%. But it's a difficult one to capture because it's often an indirect consequence of their activities. So it's often outside of their control, and also very hard to track because there's so many moving pieces, basically the supply chain and all of its suppliers. So they're often finding it difficult to estimate and track it. And the result is that there's minimal reporting on this. So that's our first one, is scope 3 emissions is often a tough one to track, and it's often a neglected piece of ESG. Ken, you can mention the next one.
Yeah, and I guess in the world of neglect, organisations probably have recognised the value of getting different perspectives and different views, and trying to get everybody to sit around the table and input into the decision-making processes. So I think the enlightened organisations have done that. Unfortunately, not every organisation has probably embraced it to the extent that perhaps the best examples have been. But increasingly, there's other stakeholders who are having a say in this now. And so while in the past people have probably felt like diversity and inclusions are nice to have, increasingly, particularly in Australia, particularly in the regulatory environment we're seeing now, it's quickly moving from a nice to have to a must have. And I think there's been a degree of fatigue, particularly at the government level, about the progress. We've seen the gender pay gap move from 27 to 24 over the last 7 years. And I think there's a degree of frustration that progress doesn't seem to be at the rate people are expecting it. And when government sees that this is a priority and they're not seeing progress, then they act, and acting often means regulation. So if you've been able to avoid it so far, it's sort of heading at us as well. So diversity and inclusion on your ESG radar is probably something that, as Meryl says, we don't want to be the bearers of bad news, but like all these things, better to be forearmed than get a nasty surprise.
Yeah, very true. The legislation is catching up quickly all around the world. Obviously, in a lot of parts of Europe, it's, well, specifically like the northern European countries, if I've got my geography right, are the ones that are quite progressed. But certainly Australia is catching up very quickly, and many other countries, even the US, India, certain other, they're no longer really considered developing countries anymore because they're moving into kind of that developed phase. So a lot of them are catching up with the legislation. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, so many of them are signed up to it. So although that is focused, we think of the Paris Agreement, we think of emissions, there's a lot more to it because it's the UN SDGs as well that is connected to that, which includes gender diversity, includes governance, includes all of these things that we're sort of mentioning today. And really the third one is when you've got, the governance part of ESG happening. I think what I see is missing is that circular thinking, underlying circular sustainable thinking at a governance level. So the board of directors, the management to, be completely intertwined with the sustainable strategy and the governance framework. And that's often missing in many businesses. Yes, the bigger players are doing a lot in this space, a lot as well out of obligation, but, those medium-sized businesses, which are a big chunk of businesses in the world, and the smaller ones need to be doing this as well, because there is often a gap between what the clients are talking to these leaders about in these businesses, or demanding more from in these businesses, and between what they're actually doing. So yes, that sustainable circular thinking at a governance level is often missing. And what I'm really seeing in terms of a trend, the neglected part, is that direct accountability. So direct accountability with the leadership in a business to be doing more and being held accountable when they're not doing enough. So yeah, thanks for joining, Mohammed, as well. I can see you on here. Hello, thank you for being here. And yes, we'll get right into it in terms of trends that we're seeing. Let me know you guys can see that all okay. Drop in a yes, say I can see that, it's all good. So the current market's seeing a lot of rapid changes, and we're seeing a lot more pressure from the community and the people, and they're having a bigger say in the way that businesses are doing things and in the way that businesses are expanding as well. And so that pressure that is growing from the not only local communities and the client base, but generally the stakeholders at various levels, internally, externally in a business, are putting a lot more pressure on these businesses to embrace ESG. And so when they're not doing that, there is a direct pitfall for the business. And in Australia, we're seeing that sustainability is really being taken up quite easily by the bigger firms, because they are kind of obligated to do so. But certainly the medium and smaller businesses, they have a big gap to fill. And as that legislation starts to come into play, a lot of these businesses are going to be playing a game of catch up. And this is a huge problem, because that catch up piece is either going to mean that their businesses is going to potentially fall flat, or that their business is going to be kind of chasing their tail for a long time before they find any kind of new position that is good and thriving in this kind of carbon economy that's evolving. So I just sort of thought I'd put in some statistics here around, what's happening around the world, that, these are the countries that are committed to net zero. These are the countries that have pledged to the Paris Agreement, that are committed to the UN SDGs. So they are committed to ESG, essentially, in some sense, because ESG is not just a investor-based tool. It's and it's not just a framework on its own. I think that's where I see a gap, is we need to understand that ESG is also leading to a roadmap of actual actionable items businesses can consider in terms of how they hit those goals, how they kind of continuously improve and hit those goals that they've set for themselves. And Ken, maybe you can even speak to sort of the diagram on the right-hand side that is really kind of depictive of the social metrics that is this.
Yeah, and I think, Meryl, your point is exactly right, that both on the E and the S front, it's sort of starting to actually encroach on G, because it's becoming about governance as well. So as organisations or countries have signed up to the SDGs, as governments start backing those commitments with legislation and regulation, and then you start to see other organisations like the ISSB, which has just released some draft standards on climate disclosures. You're starting to see regulatory bodies and intervention from others. And so in the past, I think there's been growing obligations, but increasingly as governments get behind some of these causes, it'll start to appear on boards, on government bodies, as not just a discretionary thing, but this will be an obligation they'll have to meet.
Yeah, and just an FYI, like those who don't know, the ISSB, if I get the acronym right, International Sustainability Standards Board. And they've obviously got like standardizations around sustainability, but it's very directly connected to economic value, or like financial systems. Similarly with like Financial Stability Board, the FSB, and all of those wonderful acronyms. But the idea is that there is a direct correlation between the pillars of capital, like natural capital, human capital, social capital, and economic capital. And so we need to be looking at all of these things effectively and have it sitting right at that board level for it to effectively trickle down into the way that businesses make decisions, think about things, form relationships, expand, diversify, so on, and actually then act out at a front of field level. I guess that's in front of their customers, really. Like, how do they actually take action at an operational level?
You're exactly right, man. And perhaps just to the intersection between capital markets and TCFD and ISSB, and the acronyms I assume people, but yeah, the International Sustainability Standards Board, that's part of the International Financial Reporting Standards Board. So it is becoming a mandatory obligation to start to disclose verifiable data around elements of ESG. Climate is the first cab off the rank, but others will follow. But getting that information, that's not because the standard bodies, have this idea in their own mind that this is a good thing to have. As you say, globally, capital markets are starting to demand it. And part of it was driven by purpose-driven funds initially that said, we're going to drive, use capital as a means of driving improved behaviours in these areas. But increasingly, they're finding that's challenging as well, because how do they know without the data whether the organisations they're investing in are actually meeting up to the things that they're saying they're doing around all of the elements of ES and G. And so increasingly, investors are going to drive capital to places where they've got transparency and where they can basically reliably say that their ESG goals are being met. But if that's not scary enough for them, increasingly we're seeing prosecutions. And so we've seen that in Germany, we've seen it in the UK and the US and in Australia, where organisations, ASIC has commenced prosecutions, and it said of its objectives in the next 12 months, one of its key objectives is greenwashing. And so any investor who's been out promoting the funds that they operate as being an ESG-driven fund, if they can't back that up with verifiable information, then ASIC is indicating that they're going to be investigating those things. And so the last thing anyone wants to do is to be investigated, particularly in an area where they feel perhaps unsure about the information they've got. So as you say, Meryl, it's capital is driving it, regulation is driving it. If you didn't think it was the right thing to do, it's increasingly being a mandatory thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, we've got a good question here from James, and I'll allow you to also answer to James' question, which is, what mandatory obligations in Australia are you referring to? And maybe you can speak to that around the social governance, but I'll quickly just touch on sort of other legislation, which is, to start with, it's now, well, it was always kind of in our Corporations Act that boards need to be climate diligent and need to be looking at climate metrics in their decision-making processes. And we do also have kind of that climate action plan now. It's not called the climate action plan anymore, but I'm forgetting the exact term, but there is a plan around the renewables target. There is, and this is covering all of the areas, right? So renewables, there is a plan in place by the federal government, and many of the states have committed to the climate and ecological emergency commitments around, net zero by 2050, but most of them have actually picked like 2040, in fact, for their net zero commitments. And so under that, there sits a lot of legislation around environmental reporting, around energy consumption, and around, the Climate Change Act as well is now in place. And that is like a 2022 legislation. There's actually a lot going on. And to be honest, even I'm trying to get my head around it, because Australia is in that really big process of talking about the policy, passing those bills, and then now putting in that legislation. So we'll start to see that legislation come through really quickly, because there's been a lot of grants and funding come out recently. And I know that that's also part of that process of then seeing the legislation come into play, where it becomes completely mandated, not just for the bigger businesses, but also the SMEs. But yeah, maybe you can talk things in terms of legislation, Ken.
Yeah, thanks. And James, as you say, the Climate Change Act of 2022, and 22 was a big legislative year for ESG, and probably reflecting the priorities of the new Labor government in Australia, at least. On the gender front, there's always been obligations since the passage of the Sex Discrimination Act around preventing discrimination in the workplace. The ASX best practice governance guidelines have had a requirement for listed companies, at least, to disclose their gender action plan and their gender initiatives. And that's not a mandatory obligation, but it's the classic ASX, if not, why not? So if you don't disclose that, you've got to explain the reason you haven't disclosed your gender action plan. And increasingly at federal and state level, there's growing obligations on behalf of public enterprises. And so in Victoria, they passed the Victorian Gender Equality Act, which places an obligation on all Victorian public organisations. So that's government departments, it's the universities, it's local councils, etc., to have gender action plans and report against gender action plans. So there has been obligations in the past around reporting and disclosure of people's gender equality performance and initiatives. You may be aware that the federal government passed the Workplace Gender Equality Act, which requires all organisations with more than 100 employees to file a report every year, which goes to the calculation of the the national gender pay gap, but also discloses information about gender mix at layers of management. So that's the historical setting. With the incoming Labor government in May last year, two important pieces of legislative change. One was the federal government budget, where they included a women's budget for the first time and have funded a series of initiatives around gender equality. But probably most significantly, and we'll come to it in a minute if that's okay, on the 28th of November last year, they passed the what was described as the Respect at Work legislation, which was a package of legislative amendments to the Workplace Health and Safety Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, and the Workplace Gender Equality Act, to really raise the bar on gender equality and the obligations on employers around gender equality. So if it's okay, we might just come to that naturally when we get to it.
Might just come to that when, sorry? What was that?
I think we'll get to that shortly when we roll through the presentation.
Yeah, definitely. I know you're going to cover that in a bit more detail. So yeah, that was very helpful though. Thank you for sharing all of that, Ken. And we'll kind of just, go on into the next slide and just sort of start to understand, what is the challenge and really some of the pain points that we're seeing businesses that we're speaking to, what they're facing is they're facing that reputational risk where they're not really meeting demands of their community, of their client base, of their shareholders, their stakeholders. And so that's really one of those things is around reputation. The good companies are benefiting from actually adopting all of this, but the ones who are not are starting to fall behind really quickly as they see the legislation come through. And once legislation comes through, it rolls out really quickly. There is no sort of we'll give you some time to warm up to this. It's here, it's now. And so businesses are starting to face that challenge of catching up already. Certainly in Australia, they're facing that because it's moving really rapidly. Hey, Teddy, thanks for joining. Just want to say hello and shout out. So I guess it'd be good to pose a question now to all of you out there while we talk through this. What are you seeing, whether that's in your company itself, trying to adopt an ESG framework, or whether it's yourself as an expert in this space, in some space of sustainability? What are you seeing as the kind of the biggest challenge for your businesses, or the biggest pain that they're facing in their in their operations? Maybe share that with us. But Ken, do you have anything to add around this?
I think the frustration, I think, on everybody's part is that it just seems like every time you turn around, there's another requirement, and it's not a static thing. So you can't afford to sit still on the regulatory front or the government intervention front. But going the other way, you don't need the distraction when these things go wrong. When you've got, like we're seeing the energy companies in Australia playing catch up on the transition. A lot of corporate activity driven by the transition to renewables. So if you leave these things alone and you're not proactive at addressing them, they have a way of becoming items at the top of your agenda. In the diversity and inclusion space, you've seen organisations like Rio Tinto who had the issues that workplace gender harassment and workplace gender discrimination, a full external review, and it's now become one of their top 4 priorities. You've seen the reports that were done on federal parliament, on New South Wales Parliament, on BHP, and it's the last thing an organisation needs when they've been dealing with the last 2 years of supply chain pandemic, then supply chain, and now it's a world of cost inflation, pricing pressure. So amongst all those things, the last thing you need to do is to then find that through somewhere else in the organisation, through inaction, there's been an issue that's surfaced in this area. So the really sensible thing to do is to be very active in this area, not necessarily drop everything else, but put enough time and effort and resources into these areas, and so you understand the risk, you understand the issues, and you're ahead of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you brought up the pandemic, because I know, and I would tell anyone that would listen to me when the pandemic sort of hit, is that this is just a little taster of what a climate emergency can look like. And it's a tiny taster. So imagine that this pandemic, and I'm not minimizing the pandemic, but I'm just trying to say that it's a very tiny taster of what a climate emergency can look like when it's right on our doorstep. It's certainly, banging at the gates, but it's not right on our doorstep, and we think that it's a back burner item. We can do it later. We can wait. But when it hits, you're going to be facing all of the things that we've sort of seen in the pandemic, which is a health crisis, a access crisis, a logistics crisis. Everything really, complete supply chain disruption, and access and availability of resources, of course. So there's just so much that is going to hit us at the very front end. So why not start to put these systems in place so that we can actually be ready for it, somewhat ready for it, or at the very least, start to minimize as well our impact. And as you said, if you're not worried about your impact on the environment, you don't think it's the right thing to do, fair enough. But what about the fact that once it comes banging on your door, on your front door, it's no longer waiting at the gate, then you're going to be playing a big game of catch up. And as I said, it could mean your business potentially falls flat, or it manages to scrape through a very, very challenging upcoming time. That's how I sort of think of it. Hi, Brendan. Just saying hi to Brendan, who's said hello. But yeah. Any further thoughts on that, Ken? Or otherwise, I might move on to the next one.
Yeah, we probably should keep moving, I think, Meryl. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. No problem. So, I guess, this is just to kind of capture what is the opportunity for your business. So there is economic viability in sustainability, and that's, if done right, it can really be beneficial to your business. So, this is about listening to your stakeholders at the very beginning itself, and considering the material topics for your business, so that you can effectively not just make these decisions in isolation, but actually with consideration around what your stakeholders are facing with that direct interaction with your business, and using that to then drive an ESG framework that looks at, efficiency and integration of your systems, looks at reducing your risk and building more resilient systems. And that's then when you'll start to see the economic benefits, you'll start to see the reduction in your risk profile, the resilience building into your business operations, and improved contingency, not over contingency, but improved contingency. So this is where we see the opportunity for building in an ESG framework that actually benefits your business in more than one ways. It's not just a nice to do, it's actually going to benefit your business. And I can see Brendan's comment come through that so you can see a lack of awareness in the SME space, and because there's no regulatory mandate for reporting now, and hence no sense of urgency by comparison to ASX or organizations. Yeah, that's the thing that I often find I'm having to manage, is that conversation with the SMEs when there's no full mandatory system around why they should be reporting and so on. But what would you say to that, Ken?
Yeah, and I think it's a totally valid point. I think historically the large listed companies, for a variety of reasons, lead the way, partly because they have far greater transparency. They've got obligations to report. Their stakeholders include institutional shareholders, and we're increasingly seeing institutional shareholders, particularly things like the industry super funds, who are some of the biggest investors in the country, are very active at actually starting to drive these things onto the top of the agenda. And you've seen instances like AGL where activist investors are proactively stepping in and having a say around board composition, looking at corporate activity to try and drive people's behaviour. So I think the large listed space leads the way. I think what government kind of work out is that they're an easier target, and they can sort of name and shame and reputational damage and all those things if organisations aren't moving quickly enough. But I think regulation then flows, and perhaps in the space I'll talk about, Brendan, the legislation covers every employer of over 100 people in the country. So that's sort of getting well and truly into SME territory, and there's no relief on the obligations on any basis of size. So I think in the whole ESG space, you can probably wait and see what the listed companies do first, because they're probably the ones who will have the resources to do it properly. They'll have the biggest burden. They'll probably have boards who would focus on reputation issues as well as perhaps doing the right thing. But very shortly after that, clearly we're not going to hit the climate target if you only deal with the top 500 organisations in the country. And particularly in a world where private companies, including private equity-owned companies, are the ones who are starting to be a very, very significant portion of GDP.
And I kind of just to quickly add to that as well, with the SMEs, if they're an SME, generally, they're kind of progressive or they're about to list themselves or whatever they're doing, they're likely to have a board, and already boards are obliged to have, to be climate diligent and be having climate metrics in their board level of governance, for one. But two, aside from the upcoming kind of legislation, because we're talking about it, it's upcoming, but really beyond that, there's already supply chain pressure. So if these SMEs are interacting with sort of bigger supply chains, which many of them are, then surely that supply chain effect is going to start trickling through, where their suppliers or their distributors or whoever they are saying, are you considering this sort of approval of your product, or are you considering stewardship around your process, or whatever it is? There's various things that are coming through in the supply chain pressure as well. And then sort of thirdly as well is your community and your people who buy from you and support your business. They're going to be moving away from your business when they're seeing you're not doing the right thing as well, because consumers are starting to use their money for more conscious sort of products, more ethical products in that sense. So
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, there's more than just the name.
Is don't forget about the impact on any organisation, large or small, of employee and the customer. And employees, particularly when you've got relatively tight employment, they can choose who they work for, and they'd prefer to work for an organisation that's aligned to their values. And I think increasingly this generation is looking at organisations that recognise the risks of climate change, recognise the issues of diversity and equality. But also customers. I mean, if customers have got a choice, and if all other things are equal, customers will choose an organisation that's got good credentials in this area. So I think you're right. The more enlightened organisation, whether it's large or small, will see that if it can keep the cost of these things to a manageable level, why not do it? I can see regulation heading my way. I can see bigger organisations going there. I've got customers and employees saying it's a good thing to do, and it'll help me on both of those fronts. It sort of gets to the point, well, why not do it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good comment. Thanks for that, Brendan. Appreciate that. And we just wanted to, sorry, it comes up. But we're not going to touch on this too much. I mean, really, this is just all of the kind of ways in which a proper ESG framework can then start to improve your business operations. And feel free to kind of take a snapshot of this if this will help you to look at. But this is just a way in which all of these factors will start to come together and improve the way your business operates. Because as I said, it isn't just a framework of thinking and a nice document that you can kind of plaster up on your website. It's much more than that. There's actual actionable items we've done correctly, and an action plan and a roadmap, and it's measured and it's verified and it's transparent and it's accountable, because it holds those CEOs and the C-suite accountable for the progress of your ESG framework. So it's much more than just a nice to have kind of document to get a stamp of approval that, hey, we've said we're going to do the right thing. It's much more than that. So I'm just going to touch on Scope 3 emissions. It's often the one that is neglected because it is a really difficult one to capture. And the thing is, it is an important one to address here, but I want to say that before you touch on Scope 3, always make sure that your Scope 1 and 2 is in order. You really want to get your house in order, and that's where Scope 1 and 2 sit, before you can then start to look at Scope 3. But why Scope 3 is often neglected is that collecting the data is time consuming. So, it is resource intensive to actually then connect in with your supply chain and track the data, capture the data, tag it, track it, capture it, and then actually analyze it for improvement. So it is quite a complex space, but as you start to collaborate more with your supply chain, which is really what needs to happen, when you look at it collaboratively, you can then start to actually form relationships and partner up with these suppliers in your supply chain and work with even your competitors for the greater good of kind of having oversight of your supply chain, which is a thing that most businesses are apprehensive about because it's not been the way we've often done business. We've seen our competitors at a distance and kept them there, but we need to start working with them, partnering up, and then start to actually model the scope 3 of emissions. So basically model the supply chain. And I guess the approach you take to it, whether it's using kind of modeling tools or whether it's sort of manual capture and analysis or extrapolating and benchmarking or whichever pathway you take, start to do it by working first collaboratively with your supply chain and with your competitors. Because if you're both connected to that same supply chain, there's a lot of value you can bring to each other without releasing all of your secret IP, to work together for the greater good of kind of really getting transparency on your supply chain. I just wanted to touch on Ash's comment, and also Avinash, welcome. Thank you for being here. So you said the environmental parameters in ESG produce a paradox leading to conflict and contradictory outputs. So what's your take on it? The conflict is generated by many drivers within sources, sinks, and reservoirs, where there are some this comment keeps disappearing, but where there are some measurables and unmeasurable parameters. Policy and legal regulations need to consider the significance of the environmental parameters of ESG through a paradigm shift. The net positives of energy transitions need to be looked from the magnifying glass. Is that everything? Did I read the whole thing? Sorry, Avinash, this is quite a big comment and seems to be disappearing on me. But rather than ESG reporting by financial institutions and companies reflecting those funds prioritize optimal ESG and operational and reputational risk, climate solutions and energy transitions must create room for critical thinking and engage the biological and ecological elements that can drive the current bioeconomic initiatives that are still in silos. So, I mean, really, I think at the core of it, and it's hard to kind of capture, Avinash, sorry, because it is a big comment. Maybe if you can capture your question a little bit more succinctly. I guess you did ask in terms of the environmental parameters in ESG and how they produce a paradox. What's our take on it? Have you considered that paradoxical, Ken, in your thinking around ESG?
Yeah, and perhaps just in
you guys mentioned environmental parameters in particular.
Yeah, no. Well, I think the environmental parameters, and I was sort of, I don't know if anyone watched the output from Doha, but I can't remember the percentage. I think it's something like 30% of global emissions are caused by manufacturing, and some of the biggest ones are cement manufacturing. And they had one of the sessions at Doha was about reducing the emissions from cement. And I'm starting to sound old now, but I started at Pioneer and then Boral over 20 years ago. And the things they were talking about at Doha a few weeks ago were the same things they were talking about 20 years ago. So this question about, how do you go to the core of some of the key emissions? And I think one of the, I think the question of SSRs, and this may or may not be, Avinash, what you're describing, but you're starting to see increasingly timber being used as a product to replace structural elements in construction. And I can remember the days at Boral where timber was one of its biggest products, hardwood timber, where there's 25-year rotations of timber. And if timber gets harvested and used in a process and then replanted, you've got the ability to store carbon for long periods, particularly if it's used in long life buildings or other long life uses. But ironically, the reporting says the minute you chop down that tree, it's assumed that all of the emissions are released into the environment. So I think that's perhaps one example of a paradox, and I'm sure there's plenty of others in the renewable space. And
Yeah.
I'm by no means an expert, but I think it's a really valid point. Is you've got to be really careful with regulation. You don't drive people's behaviours to something which is actually contrary to what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. And I guess, my thoughts on that as well, if I have kind of honestly, Avinash, is that with an ESG framework, if done correctly, the sort of three really important at the start of it, in my sort of view, is a materiality assessment where you're actually listening to your stakeholders and understanding their direct view on your operations and the impacts, therefore, on environment, social systems, and so on, and governance. Is the materiality assessment needs to happen and needs to happen effectively. The second thing is to make sure that the right people are in the room, and are selected to kind of be a part of the discussion. So probably that goes collectively with the materiality assessment. But the other thing is looking at the market and where the market is going. So what are the benchmarks of, your competitors or really the ones that you admire in this space and that are doing really great things. So how can we look at them and really learn from them, not try to recreate the wheel. We're really going to lean in what is already happening and happening well. And probably, now I've forgotten my third point, that I really think that ultimately, done correctly, an ESG framework has to consider all of these moving parts together and have the right people in the room, just as you've said in your comment, Avinash, is that we need to have all of the right people in the room from different parts of the business, and not just the technical people or the key leaders. It needs to have accounts, it needs to have legal, it needs to have front field operators, everybody in there talking about it collectively. And it makes it longer. It takes longer to come to a conclusion, but it's much more effective if done correctly to come up with a priority structure to then build out your roadmap. So, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Sorry, it was a bit of a long comment. So I was just trying to capture the question itself. So hopefully we've answered that for you. But, I just wanted to sort of talk about Zero Circle, one of our strategic partners, really incredible platform that helps look at the scope 3 emissions, really helps look at the supply chain in particular. It's really about creating the right partnerships and then creating the right data capturing processes to finally start to report and create a profile around your sustainability in terms of supply chain in particular. So I won't talk too much about this. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about this and this solution, let me know. I will more than happily share with you. But I will let Ken do his thing, and Ken, let me know when you want me to move on to the next slide. Because we are getting close to time, so I'm going to move past mine and really let you kind of take the stage.
Thanks, Meryl. Yeah, we'll race this because I think we've covered pretty much the scene setting, which is up until now there's been a set of voluntary or semi-voluntary obligations in a legislative framework that put some obligations in place on behalf of anybody who was an employer. That game all changed in November last year when they passed a new piece of legislation described the Respect at Work Act, which made some fundamental amendments to three pieces of legislation: the Sex Discrimination Act, the Workplace Gender Equality Act, and the Work Health and Safety Act. And it essentially flipped the obligation from employees who make a complaint and then potentially triggers some responses in the Sex Discrimination Act or the Workplace Health and Safety Act to now a positive obligation on the part of all employers in Australia to prevent any type of discrimination in the workplace. And it's quite broad. The legislation was sort of couched in terms of preventing sexual gender-based harassment in the workplace, but in the drafting, it was broadly extended to include any discrimination on the basis of gender in the workplace, and it's a positive obligation on the part of all organisations who have employees. It's couched in terms of scaling up on the bigger the organisation, so it talks about reasonable and proportionate steps based on the size of the organisation. but it's a positive obligation on everybody. So, I think the question of SMEs, this hits SMEs on big organisations. It hits them, but with a higher burden and a higher bar. And it now creates a legislative breach, or it's a breach under the Act, to allow an environment where it's considered to be hostile on the grounds of sex. And the interesting thing is that there's not really a trigger for what is considered to be an environment that's discriminatory or hostile. And a lot of organisations, and you could imagine the bigger organisations, the risk managers and the general counsels are all scrambling to say, what does this mean? But my comment to them is, have a look at your gender pay gap. Your gender pay gaps on average across the country for big employers at around 24%. Prima facie, that's evidence of discrimination, because there's a difference in the way you pay males and females in your organisation. Now, there may be valid and supportable reasons to respond to that, but the way this works is the Australian Human Rights Commission and the Sex Discrimination Commissioner can commence an investigation if they see evidence of discrimination in the workplace, whether that's through complaints, media reporting, or it could be as simple as looking at the list of companies that have filed reports under the WGEA and seeing those that have a significant gender pay gap. So it really flips around the obligations to now employers to not just respond to issues and be ready to deal with issues if they arise. They've got to be proactive. And so in the world of preventing gender discrimination and preventing, creating a more gender equal organisation, it's gone from being something which organisations would say it's a nice thing to do, and I can see some obligations to prevent bad behaviour. Now they've got a positive obligation to actually encourage and create an environment where there's good behaviour.
Yeah. And also, please just tell us, what is WGEA?
Oh, sorry, the Workplace Gender Equality Act. So that's a piece of federal legislation that creates an obligation on everybody who employs more than 100 people to file reports every year, and that report calculates the gender pay gap. So you have data which people are self-reporting, which could actually contain elements of evidence on potentially discrimination. So perhaps that's the negative. So, and I'm sure everybody who's responsible for broad-based ESG will be sort of going, okay, great. So now I've got to explain to everybody another obligation. It's all very well that, the government keeps sort of like piling up more and more obligations on us. How do we actually respond to these? And so there's a few, I think, logical and simple things that you can do, and perhaps just flip one forward if you could, Meryl.
The next one,
yeah, if you wouldn't mind, and a lot of these are, fairly self-evident, but it's not a bad place to start with some form of a checklist. So if you're an employer, I think there's now an expectation and an onus on leadership to be actively promoting and supporting gender equality in the workplace. I think that's an easy thing to do. It doesn't take a lot of effort, but leaders, I think, need to get behind the concept that harassment and discrimination is unacceptable, and then also get behind these other programs. So I think most organisations are regularly doing some form of survey. It could be rudimentary, but a survey that gives a baseline on what is the culture and what is the sense around the organisation about how we treat women, and is there a fairness and equity in the way we treat them. Bread and butter stuff, make sure you've got policies and procedures that make it very clear that discrimination and harassment is unacceptable. Make sure you've got training that reflects the current obligations, and go back and look at the training programs and make sure they're very good and up to date. It's important that if there is an issue, that there's a way for employees to be able to sensitively and in a trusted way communicate issues. So an employee who wants to say something, they need to know they can trust the channel, but also have control over the process, because not always do people want to create litigation or something. And we've seen, in federal parliament examples where these things can get an absolute life of their own. And sometimes employees want to have these things managed in a discreet way. But also, once an issue's arisen, that's not when you should be starting to come up with a policy for or an approach to dealing with them. So make sure there's a resolution process that actually acknowledges that there's quite a few people involved. There's the employee making the complaint. There's the employee who's the subject of the complaint. There could be managers, there could be others. And so don't wait until the last minute to have these things in place. Often you'll have existing OH&S practices. A lot of those can be basically engaged to be a way of collecting information and reporting issues. And of course, for everybody's self-preservation, make sure that the risk management processes also capture these things as well. So it gets tracked in the normal reporting process around risk, like I think other ESG things have been for some time. And then we're I think running short of time, Meryl. Just going forward, data collecting information, knowing that you're making progress, identifying where in the organisation these issues are, getting on top of them. It's good because it will create a more sensitive organisation to diversity issues in putting all these things in place, as well as actually preserving the organisation from having a knock on the door from the Human Rights Commissioner wanting to launch an investigation and commence proceedings. So there's a range of ways of tracking how you're going and seeing the benefits or otherwise of the programs you're implementing. So just very quickly as we sort of count down, plenty of things that you can look at, and by all means, look at this or send me an email if you've got any questions about what an organisation can do in response.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll let you look at the comments as well. Avinash has left a comment there for you as well around sort of some points around things that are happening around the world. But I'll let you look at that. But aside from that, as Ken said, if you have any questions on any of this, reach out to us. We're both connected on this particular this particular post and live, so you can reach out at any point to talk to us. But really, what we want to say is, in closing around this, is that we want to invite you, if you're a business and you're looking to adopt an ESG strategy into your business operations, that we'd love to offer you 45 minutes to jump on a call with us, where we will really kind of dive into where your business is at now. Where is that opportunity for growth and expansion through sustainability? What does that roadmap really look like to get you from that point A to point B? And so that's what we'd like to offer. It's really as part of this webinar, that's something extra that we'd like to do with you and for your business. So let us know. You'd reach out directly if this is of interest. If you've watched this live or even later on, just let us know and reach out, and we'd be open to connecting. So we just wanted to thank all of you. Thank you for being here. And yes, absolutely, James, reach out to Ken. And he's just mentioned he's going to reach out to you, Ken, just FYI.
Right.
But, we want to thank you all for being here. And I want to thank you, Ken, as well for joining me on this. And really appreciate your input and value.
No, thanks for hosting, Meryl. Great job. Terrific.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. I'm going to stop sharing, and you can, hold on, where are we? Yeah, you can reach out, as I said. Would love to chat with you. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for, or evening or morning, or wherever you are in the world, depends really. But as I said, reach out directly if you wanted to chat. And other than that, take care, everybody. And thank you for joining us live and spending this last hour with us.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. So long.
Thanks all.